This week in news surrounding Israel, I'm going to be talking about judicial reform in Israel and what it's all about. So stay tuned, friends, for all the details. Well, shalom, everyone. Welcome once again to this week's newscast. I'm Robert Gottslig, your host. And last week, I covered Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and his anti-Semitic hatred for the Jewish people as he called Israel a cancerous growth that must be removed. I also mentioned on how he was gloating over the unrest in Israel, over the judicial reform, saying that Israel is on a path to disappearance. Well, if you watch that newscast, I also mentioned that he ought to tremble over his hatred for God's chosen people because God has promised in his word that as long as the sun, moon, and stars are shining in the sky and the natural ordinances and function of this world is intact, Israel will not cease from being a nation before God forever, period. Period, friends. But what is this? What's all the fuss about in Israel? Why are there all the protests and the unrest? Well, it has to do very simply with Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition government wanting to bring reform to the judiciary. In particular, which just passed in the Knesset, was legislation that limits the Supreme Court's ability to review the reasonableness of government decisions. Of course, friends, Israel, unlike the United States, does not have a constitution to govern the country, but rather it has basic laws that serve as the foundation for the country's legal system and government structure. And the Supreme Court justices are the ones who uphold the basic laws. The problem is that these justices are not elected in a democratic fashion, but rather they are all self-appointed and they are all liberal, left-leaning. And up to this point, they were really, friends, the ones who are running the show. They were also responsible for introducing the idea of the reasonableness doctrine, that they could overturn any laws set by Israel's legislative branch, which restricts the voice of the elected government. So simply, if a law was trying to be passed, they could look at it and say, is it reasonable? And they could just strike it down, just like that. And so really, friends, for those who are sowing seeds of discord in the country, saying that Netanyahu and his government are trying to destroy Israel's democracy, the opposite is actually true. Bibi is trying to balance the power and strengthen Israeli democracy by really giving the voice back to the people. To give you just a little bit of more understanding on this reasonableness doctrine and how the justices were using it, I'd like to just share a little bit about our leadership tour that we took to Israel back in May of 2022, as we were invited by the ZOA, that is the Zionist Organization of America. The Friends of Israel and the ZOA have had a long-standing relationship for many years, and they invited us on this leadership tour. And the idea of the tour was really to bring awareness to us of what Israel faces day to day in some of the troubled areas in the country. We found ourselves in Sderot, which is just bordering on the Gaza border there. And we got to talk to the people and hear their concerns in this thriving city. But yet all these missiles and rockets are flying over from Gaza and landing into their country. And really, the people, though they're resilient, it's having an effect on them. So we got to see that firsthand. We also found ourselves in Hebron on a bulletproof bus, going to Hebron at the Tomb of the Patriarchs, really, and just to see, again, all the checkpoints there that the IDF has up to try to maintain peace. And again, seeing what Israel faces on a day-to-day basis. We also found ourselves in some briefings from the IDF. We also were in the Knesset, and we heard from members of the Knesset. And while we were there, we were also educated on areas A, B, and C. Friends, these are the areas in Judea and Samaria, what the world likes to call the West Bank, but Israel's heartland, biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria. As a result of the Oslo Accords, they divided it up into A, B, and C. Of course, Area A is 100% controlled by the Palestinians. Area B is a 50-50 split between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And of course, Area C is 100% controlled by Israel. And within Area C, we saw some troubling things, friends, where the Bedouin, is a nomadic people, they're being allowed to set up and remain in villages within Area C. That's against the law. And so what happens here is a water truck shows up, or two, and by the way, they're supplied by the European Union. You can see their flag on the water truck. So this water truck shows up, and the Bedouin, being a nomadic people, hey, if there's water there, we're in business. The next thing you know, there's a school. Now the town has a name, and it begins to grow more and more and more. Now, the question was simple. Why does Israel allow it in the first place? And it came back to the Supreme Court, because the way they look at it is, well, is it reasonable to tear these down? After all, we're going to look like the bad guys if we do. But is it reasonable to tear these down? Because, after all, the Palestinians in Area A didn't get as much land as we got in Area C, and therefore, they leave it. And so they use this reasonableness doctrine. Also, at our time at the Knesset, a question was asked, why in the world would Israel allow an Arab party to exist in their parliament? Friends, you've heard people accuse Israel of being apartheid. There's nothing apartheid about Israel. They allow an Arab party to be part of their parliament, to allow them to be part of the Knesset, friends. And the Arab party, these are anti-Zionist parties that speak out against the country. Again, what does the Supreme Court have to say about that? Well, did they really mean what they said? Do they really not want an Israel here? And so you see how this reasonable doctrine begins to affect things that are happening in the country. And so you can also see why Benjamin Netanyahu wants some judicial reform. And these justices, friends, they can even deny appointments by elected officials simply by basing their decision on reasonableness. Is it reasonable to have that person? But keep in mind, what may be reasonable to a liberal-minded person may not be the same as to a conservative, right? And thus, really, some reform is needed. Also up for reform is the ability for the elected government to have some say as to who is appointed to the Supreme Court, instead of the justices just being self-appointing, which ultimately, as I said, Bibi is trying to give the voice back to the people. That's what democracy is, friends. It makes a lot of sense. But instead, what we have seen are massive protests of hundreds of thousands of people protesting against the reform. I just want to inform you also, there was about 250,000 that were in favor of it. But you see this big unrest and this big divide here. And friends, again, listening to the lies of the opposition, listening to the lies of the media and the unions, all saying that Bibi is trying to set up a dictatorship and trying to destroy democracy. Well, I'll tell you, there is nothing democratic about a left-wing, liberal, self-appointed court made up of these justices, and really the people have no say in it. That's not democratic. And furthermore, these encouraged protests, friends, are nothing more than the elite calling for chaos and disorder to try to oust Benjamin Netanyahu because of their hatred and dislike for him. They wish him dead. This is the elite. This is the elite, friends. There is a real spiritual battle taking place today. And not only in Israel, because there's a lot of similarities around the world. Look at what's happening in the United States with the 45th president. There's a spiritual battle that's taking place, and it's all over the world. And the world is moving more and more into disorder every day, friends, which is paving the way for a world leader the Bible calls the Antichrist to come onto the world stage to bring a so-called peace. And friends, that's where this is all heading. And that's what I'm going to be talking about next week, Lord willing. Especially, we're going to look at it as how it relates in particular to Israel. So in the meantime, friends, let's pray for the situation in Israel. Let's pray that calm will prevail as the government tries to bring balance to the judicial system. And with that, until next time, thanks for joining us on another episode of In News Surrounding Israel. God bless, friends.